This channel is part of the History Hit network.
Stand, damn you! In the name of your king, stand, I say!
On the 14th of June, 1645, the last field army to be led by King Charles I met the new model army under Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell. The outcome would prove decisive.
In the name of your king, stand, I say!
It's of me, use your majesty! We must away!
I should not be so base. Unhand me, sir. Men, I shall go about this business as befits God's anointed sovereign. Will you with me?
In God's name, sire, will you go upon your death in an instant? The work of the devil is with thee. March on the right hand!
The wreck of the King's army on Naseby Field provided rich pickings for the jubilant parliamentarians. This victory had been total, and to the victor, the spoils. The King's last major field army was destroyed completely, and all of his baggage train had fallen into the hands of his enemies. Money, valuables, food and clothing were all there for the taking. But amidst the shambles was a prize of even greater value to the Roundheads. They had been victorious on the field, but here too was the means to win the war of propaganda.
We dare not hide this evidence under a bushel, but freely hold it out to our brethren to read. Tis in the King's own handwriting, taken from his baggage on the field of Naseby, sir. Shows the contempt that he holds for his people. It is in his own hand, sir.
Respect he bows upon his people.
God elect, this is seditious doggerel, sir.
It is from his private letters, sir, taken on the field of Naseby. It is truth, sir, and is printed by the Parliament. 'Twas a great sin against the miracles of God to conceal the evidence of truth.
Private correspondence of His Majesty Charles I.
On ready, sir. Thank you, thank you.
See how much respect he bows.
The papers that were taken on the field of Naseby. Read the treachery of your king and the contempt he holds for his people and the great riches he bestows upon his council. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
The King's cabinet open.
For those that will debate and make it their profession to oppose the truth and think it below us. Tell, who would take this great knowledge 1 penny? The treason and the contempt your king bestows upon his people and the great riches he bestows upon his council. Here is proof of his foul treachery, published by special order of Parliament, sir. In his own handwriting, taken from his baggage at Naseby. The battle on the field. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Who would take this great knowledge for 1 penny?
History Hit is like Netflix, just for history fans, with exclusive history documentaries covering some of the most famous people and events in history just for you. With familiar faces such as Dan Jones and Dr. Eleanor Janega, we've got hundreds of documentaries covering the greatest figures and events of medieval history. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Chronicle fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code CHRONICLE at checkout.
For Charles Stuart, the closing months of the fatal year 1645 were to prove almost the most miserable period, even for that unhappy monarch. While the parliamentarians rejoiced, the king drifted from place to place in a vain search for the military support which would sustain his cause. He had seen his last significant field army shattered by the triumphant Roundheads. His personal correspondence, revealing his most secret schemes, had been captured and published to a hostile population. Only Oxford, his last real stronghold, offered any real sanctuary. But now the parliamentarian net was closing even there. By November 1645, the outlook was black indeed. But in the spring of that year, everything had been very different. Although Prince Rupert had lost the Earl of Newcastle's northern army at Marston Moor in the previous summer, this had been compensated for by the king's own successes with his Oxford army at Cropredy Bridge and Lostwithiel. 1644 had ended with some very real causes for optimism for the Royalists, and Charles had genuine reason to think he might yet win the war.
At the beginning of 1645, particularly in June, the beginning of the Naseby campaign, the Royalists had every reason to be highly optimistic. Everything seemed to be going their way. They just had news of Montrose's victory at Old Erne, which was effectively neutralising Leven up in the north. The parliamentary party was riven with strife, was riven with dissension in its own ranks, and as a result of that, they made some very ill-judged decisions, and in particular the one of pinning Fairfax around Oxford, because he'd been instructed to lay siege to Oxford, despite all the evidence from earlier parts of the Civil War that sieges were very wasteful and that it was armies free in the field that won victories. Now, effectively, that gave Charles a free hand. He could move wherever he liked in the Midlands. He was completely free, and he was able to move north or south. And in fact, on the one hand, it was a massive advantage for Charles, but on the other hand, it did open a certain amount of dissent in his own ranks. And there was some tension between two contrary opinions in the Royalist camp. On the one hand, you had Rupert, who wanted to march north and recruit people from Yorkshire, because he believed that they could actually build up the army significantly that way. And there was a second party led by Digby who wanted to effectively march south and take all Royalist concentration in that direction.
As he met with Goring and Rupert to plan the coming campaign, the king had some grounds for measured optimism. In some respects, he was even cheerful.
As we wrote to our own dear Queen, I may, without being too sanguine, confirm that since this rebellion started, our affairs have never been in so hopeful a way.
To lay against the king's optimism, however, there were a large number of obstacles and dangers. Not least the numerical superiority of his parliamentarian opponents, now grouped into the famous New Model Army.
So, gentlemen, that is how we find ourselves. What say you, Goring?
Clearly the news is not of the very best, Your Majesty, but there are things to please us yet.
Why say you so?
Well, this new noddle of theirs. It may one day grow to be a strong opponent, but as of now, it is like a newborn babe. Weak and uncoordinated. If we were to fall upon it now, with all our forces, we could crush this demon in its cradle.
Were it so easy. But we have so little strength left to us.
It is not so, Majesty. Draw upon the garrisons. Slight the unnecessary fortresses. Call together every man we have, and ye shall have enough force to meet them in the field.
It may prove too rash to abandon all we have, but we do like the measure of what you propose.
Sage words indeed, Your Majesty, but I urge you to heed my counsel.
Stay. We shall heed your counsel, but we shall also heed that of our royal nephew.
As I have said so many times, mine uncle, only to the north is there any real hope.
Why so?
Montrose shows us all the way with these victories. A juncture with such a man would create a powerful army.
Thou speakest well, nephew. Our own mind, too, is to march to the worthy Montrose.
Then let us waste no more time. Let us march north.
Patience, nephew. We shall march as you counsel. But there is time yet.
In attempting to appease all of the competing factions, Charles Stuart was once again displaying the indecision which was to plague his cause. Arrayed against him was the new model army, ably led by its commander, Sir Thomas Fairfax. It was not yet the force it would become, but Fairfax himself was a formidable opponent. Although Sir Thomas was its commander, the formation of the new model army had in fact been brought about chiefly by the energy of Oliver Cromwell. It was he who had grown tired of the politicians, who had used their military positions for their own ends rather than for the common good. In a famous speech, he moved the House of Commons towards the famous self-denying ordinance, which forced all existing members of Parliament to resign their places of command in the army.
The members of both houses have got great places and commands, and the sword into their hands, and will perpetually continue themselves in grandeur, and not permit the war speedily to end, lest their own power should die with it.
Hear, hear, sir.
I know the worth of those commanders, members of both houses, who are all still in power. But if I may speak my conscience without reflection upon any, I do conceive, if the army be not put into another method, and the war more vigorously prosecuted, the people can bear the war no longer, and they will enforce you to a dishonourable peace.
Hear, hear.
But this I would recommend to your prudence, and I hope we have here such true English hearts and zealous affection towards the general weal of our mother country, as no member of either house will scruple to deny themselves or their own private interests for the public good.
Aye.
The self-denying ordinance paved the way for a new army, led by commanders who were ready to prosecute the war to a military conclusion. Whereas Essex and all of the other MPs who held positions resigned and never again took up senior positions, Cromwell survived. This was probably thanks to Fairfax, who felt the great man indispensable to the parliamentarian cause, and petitioned Parliament to that effect. Accordingly, Cromwell was allowed to take up his position as commander of the cavalry in the new model army. The faith and trust Fairfax placed in him was to prove entirely correct.
The stories come down to us that Cromwell somehow managed to avoid the self-denying ordinance, and this is used partly as evidence that Cromwell was both a hypocrite and somewhat manipulative. In fact, that's not true. The self-denying ordinance, which was passed, the one that was finally passed by both Houses of Parliament, did not actually prohibit members of Parliament from holding commissions in the army. What it did was required officers that were holding current commissions from the Parliament to lay down those commissions within 40 days after the Act had been passed. However, there was nothing in the self-denying ordinance at all which precluded the reappointment of officers.
In the field, the new model army mustered some 15,000 men. Against his formidable foe, the king chose to concentrate only 11,000 men, leaving the rest of his forces to hold garrisons in towns and castles scattered throughout the land. Some scholars have argued that, ultimately, it may have been his downfall. But it has often been suggested that had he been more resolute in his ambition, a single field army of 20,000 royalists could theoretically have taken the field in May 1645.
The thought has been that had Charles denuded his garrisons of their troops, that he could have fielded a much larger army against the new model at Naseby. The main source for this contention, incidentally, is Brigadier Peter Young, who is a well-known authority in the field. But if you have a look at the position, it wasn't so straightforward. Charles, or the Royalists in general, had very little territory left. And what territory they had to defend against parliamentary garrisons which ringed them. In the north, they virtually had nothing. In the Midlands, they had one or two scattered garrisons. They were only strong in the southwest, and yet in the southwest, the parliamentarians had 3 very strong garrisons which effectively neutralised the troops that the Royalists had down in that area. As far as I can see, the only source of extra troops that Charles would have had would have been Goring's detachment, which consisted of about 4,500, 3,000 horse, 1,500 foot. Now, had Goring obeyed orders, then that would have brought Charles's army up to near parity with the new model army. But of course, Goring, being ambitious, saw himself as a replacement for Hopton in the west, rather dallied around in the southwest and didn't come to Charles's aid when he was ordered to. So effectively what I would say is that apart from that one detachment, I don't think Charles could really have afforded to field a larger army, because that would have meant conceding territory to the parliamentarians, which was something he was desperate to avoid.
So it was that Charles Stuart gathered about him the last great army that he was to call into the field. As the regiments left Oxford, the remaining garrison silently watched them march out. There was a great deal of tension in the still air. The king's capital was already being loosely blockaded. Oxford had already survived one siege, and there were rumours of a new Roundhead army marching to besiege the city again. Even with the reinforcements which joined him, the king's forces for the campaign of Naseby never amounted to more than 12,000 men. He was about to face the new model army, 15,000 strong. "350 years on, opinion is very much divided as to what Charles hoped to achieve in his last campaign. The strategic situation was of course very difficult for the Royalists. The territory which could be said to be Royalist controlled had shrunk during 1644 from approximately half the area of England and Wales to a little more than a quarter. Royalist territory was now exclusively located in Wales and the southwest. Worse still, these were among the least opulent areas of the country. The prosperous areas around London remained firmly in Roundhead hands, as they had done since the outbreak of the war. These areas also supplied far greater numbers of men and munitions. Only in Scotland was there a glimmer of hope for Charles. In the remote north of the country, the daring Marquis of Montrose had won a string of victories. His small royalist force had caused the powerful Scots army operating in the north of England on behalf of the Parliament, to turn and keep a wary eye on its homeland. The new model army was therefore deprived of what could have been a powerful second pincer, in a grand encircling movement designed to crush the king's capital from the north and south. In that spring of 1645, Charles hoped to march north and join forces with Montrose, whose rising star was beginning to eclipse that of even his favourite Prince Rupert. In early May, news had reached him of yet another famous victory by Montrose, this time at Old Erne. A juncture with this great new general seemed to be the most obvious hope of salvation for the hard-pressed royalists.
Montrose was one of the great mythological figures of the Civil War, a very attractive figure, a very, very brave man and a remarkable soldier. I mean, his activities in Scotland were indeed all the more remarkable when you consider that his army was very small and had a habit of disappearing at regular intervals. He was badly supplied. And in fact, if I can say, from what I can gather, I don't think that the Stuarts themselves took Montrose very seriously. Certainly he wasn't provided with the men and equipment that he'd asked for. He was more or less dispatched to go away and do whatever he could in the north, but I don't think they were particularly interested. Nevertheless, the Royalists were deeply moved by the series of successes, remarkable successes that Montrose had. And just prior to Naseby in particular, there was the news of the victory at Oldham, and that was followed up later by victory at Alford, which again was a remarkable victory. Small, ill-equipped army, which was able to defeat the Scottish National Army, rather than the Covenanting Army, the Scottish National Army, which was much better equipped, much better resourced, simply through his ability to apply tactics and strategy. Historians such as Gardner have put forward the opinion that Montrose was a superb strategist, a very good tactician, but he was also a romantic, and what he was chasing was, in the end, I think, quite unrealistic. We mustn't forget that Montrose was one of the first signatories of the National League and Covenant. He was a Presbyterian. He believed in the Presbyterian system of church government. It was his fond hope that Charles could be brought to support the Presbyterian system of church government throughout the country. And that is something that Charles would not do, as subsequent history demonstrated. So as far as the long-term outcome of Montrose's campaigns is, even had he been fully successful, and as we know, he was eventually defeated at Philiphaugh, what he was fighting for would not have been achieved.
Charles was still the object of two competing schools of advice from his council. The first group, led by the vocal Prince Rupert, urged that the king move north as soon as possible to join forces with the Marquis of Montrose. The other school, led by Goring and Digby, recognised the danger posed by the new model army, and urged that the king take the field against this dangerous new foe while it was still in its infancy. The new model army was not yet the invincible machine which history would depict it as. It was badly supplied, disorganized. Even the famous redcoats were still to be issued to many units of the army. Despite this fleeting opportunity, Charles, as usual, made a muddled compromise. As was his custom, he appears to have attempted to appease both parties. As a result, there was little in the way of a coherent plan for the last campaign of Charles I. The various factions within the court still vied for power, and no clear overall strategy was ever established. As he joined his king for the last campaign of 1645, Goring was as intractable as ever, and the king therefore became the victim of the power struggle between Goring and Prince Rupert. Torn between two competing objectives, it would appear that Charles could not choose between either council. In the end he moved north, looking for that juncture with Montrose, as Rupert counselled. All the while, he still hoped to confront the new model army in the field, as Goring counselled. In reality, the defeat of the new model army was his only real chance left to win the war. And in his heart, Charles must have known it to be true. As is often the case in military campaigns, error can seem to compound error. And at this point, Charles I was to make another of the grave mistakes which characterized his handling of the First Civil War. Prince Rupert detested Lord Goring, who was to become the king's commander in the West. The young prince succeeded in persuading Charles to order Goring to be sent back with his cavalry to help the royalist cause in the West Country, rather than remaining with the Oxford army. Subsequent events caused Charles to alter the orders, so that Goring was to attempt to head off a suspected thrust by Fairfax in the direction of Oxford. While there is little doubt that the Western royalists needed relief, the presence of 2,000 cavalry was much more crucial to the king's army, already outnumbered by a powerful foe, who would seek no excuse to give battle at the first opportunity. Moreover, there is certainly very little that such a meagre force could have achieved against Fairfax. Nonetheless, Prince Rupert's counsel prevailed, and Goring, with 2,000 precious cavalrymen, was sent into the West on his ambiguous mission. For his part, Goring disliked Rupert, and relished the opportunity for independent command. In reality, he probably had little intention of being drawn back to Oxford, or into the sphere of the prince. So it was that self-interest was to undermine the king's cause at its most crucial juncture. Given Goring's yearning for the freedom of the West, it probably came as no surprise to Charles to find that no sooner had he left Oxford on his march north than the new model army arrived and laid siege to the city. Fairfax had easily eluded Goring, who had marched straight to Taunton, and the new model army grew in strength and confidence with every day that passed. The king was now in a serious dilemma. If Oxford was lost, the royalist cause would suffer a huge blow to its already faltering morale. On the other hand, if the city could hold out for 6 or 8 weeks, it would give him time to effect his meeting with Montrose, largely unhindered. For his strategy to succeed, the king, therefore, needed to draw the parliamentarians away from the city by a bold action. In this he was to prove entirely successful, though more by chance than design. Rupert suggested that they make a preemptive strike against a parliamentarian town. Charles still recalled with horror the scenes he had witnessed at the storming of Bristol in 1643, and he was at first reluctant to sanction the action now proposed by Rupert. The persistence of the prince ultimately paid off, however, and Rupert was able to persuade the reluctant king of the wisdom of his plan to storm the parliamentarian town of Leicester.
We do not know yet, Uncle, if Oxford can stand as you would wish.
What is our alternative?
By a strong show of force, we may draw their army away from us.
By what means exactly, nephew?
We must fall upon one of their weaker positions.
To confess, we like it not. But where would you propose such a thing?
To my mind, Leicester is the most logical option.
No. There must be no more unnecessary effusion of blood. The storming of towns is the devil's business.
Not this one. The garrison is weak. The defense is insubstantial.
The price will be too high. You forget, our subjects are both within and without the walls.
No, mine uncle. You have my word.
And so it was that the Royalist army came to storm Leicester. But it was not to be the simple affair which Rupert had promised. Prince Rupert supervised the placing of the artillery batteries himself, and much to the king's horror, the town was stormed amidst great slaughter. A portion of the defenders were Scots, and no quarter was offered to them, as the contemporary diarist Richard Simmons later recalled in his memoirs. The Earl of Northampton's horse, about 1 of the clock, were let in at the ports, and they scoured the town. In the meantime the foot got in and fell to plunder, so that ere day fully open, scarce a cottage unplundered. There were many Scots in this town, and no quarter was given to any in the heat of battle. In this nightmare situation, the defenders of the town fought on. The surviving defenders of the East Gate were surrounded in St. Martin's churchyard. Some of those who had defended the Newark breach continued the struggle about the High Cross, where a handful of Scots dragoons held out. For this, they and the many other occupants of the town paid with their lives.
Members of Parliament. Surely it is both right and proper that we defend our interests from within the army.
The actions of the new model army were controlled from Parliament by the Committee of Both Kingdoms. The news of the storming of Leicester provoked a panic in the House and among some members of the committee. Drastic action was now required. Accordingly, Fairfax was instructed to abandon the siege of Oxford and march with all speed to oppose the king. So unsettled were the parliamentarians that they even began to seriously consider new terms for a peace with the king. It seems that the doubting thoughts, such as those of the Earl of Manchester, were once more at the forefront of the parliamentary debate. Old fears re-emerged, and it was Manchester who had sagely noted to Cromwell that however many times Parliament beat the king, he was the king still. But if Parliament was defeated just once, they would all be hanged and their families disinherited. Cromwell's fierce reply was that it represented a cowardly argument against fighting ever again. And furthermore, if that was the case, why had they taken up arms in the first place? At the time of the first debate, Cromwell had prevailed over Manchester and the advocates of a peaceful settlement with the king. Yet it seemed that every time Parliament suffered a setback, the peace party came to the fore. Men of iron like Cromwell ultimately triumphed over the doubters and waverers, but sometimes they were run close. The early summer of 1645 was just one such time.
People tend to think of the Civil War in terms of two very easily identified sides. Nothing could be further from the truth. In the case of the parliamentarian side, there was always a great rift between two broad tendencies within the parliamentary party. There were those who were dubbed the War Party and those who were dubbed the Peace Party. Now, the main difference between the two was that people like Cromwell, who was of the War Party, wanted to prosecute the war as a war and bring it to a successful conclusion. The Peace Party were always a lot more equivocal about that as an objective, and they felt that they were still, properly speaking, the king's subjects and wanted to make a point with the king. They didn't necessarily want to defeat the king. Now, these tensions often got buried when the war itself needed the attention of particularly the Commons. But whenever an opportunity arose to try and appease or to come to terms with the king, then the rift began to widen. Now, later on, this division in the parliamentary side solidified into a fight between the Presbyterians and the Independents. The Presbyterians, by and large, tended to dominate the Commons, and they tended to be the ones that were most vigorously pursuing the Peace Party line. On the other hand, the Independents, who were dominant in the army, were deeply suspicious of royalist intentions, deeply suspicious of the Queen Henrietta Maria, who of course was a Catholic, and they were vigorous Protestants. So they tended to want to bring the war to a successful conclusion. Now, after Naseby, what happened, of course, was that people thought that the war was very close to a conclusion. They wanted to bring it to a conclusion. They wanted to do everything in their power to bring it to a conclusion. And the two sides came out again at that point because there were two different solutions to the problem. On the one hand, there were the attempts to bring the king to the negotiating table, which was pursued most vigorously by the Presbyterian majority in the Commons, the Peace Party, led by people like Denzil Hollis. And on the other hand, the army that again wanted to, as it were, disable the king from prosecuting a war and then bring him to the negotiating table. And this rift between the two parties, in fact, became more and more virulent as time went on. As we know later on, the army mutinied because the Commons themselves wanted to disband the army and were withholding pay. And it was precisely for the reason that the army was as seen as an instrument of the Independents and therefore the War Party by the Commons. And the Presbyterians in the Commons were deeply frightened by that.
Whatever the complexities of the political scene, in the end, the men of action triumphed over the Peace Party, and Fairfax headed north with his new model army, ready to face the king in what was to become a final reckoning. As fate would have it, the king now changed his plans once more. Believing Oxford to be in great danger, the king absconded his move north to link with Montrose, and instead began to move south to the relief of Oxford. Urgent messages were sent to the west in a desperate attempt to recall Goring with his precious cavalry. Charles believed the city to be hard-pressed, but unbeknown to him, Oxford was already freed by Fairfax's move north to confront the king. This fateful coincidence placed the two armies on a collision course. The Battle of Naseby would be the outcome of that collision. The fog of war now came into play. Inexplicable as it may seem to our modern minds, it seems both armies lost sight of exactly where the other was. But after some jockeying for position in the Midlands, the two armies finally came face to face with each other near the tiny village of Naseby on the morning of June the 14th, 1645.
Looking back 300 years from the point of view of the 20th century, of course, we've got a very distorted view of distance and range and information. I mean, for us, it's actually quite easy in some ways to keep track of people because we've got the telephone, the television, and so on. But in the 17th century, they didn't have those kinds of communications. Indeed, they didn't even have roads as we understand them. Many of the roads were cart tracks. And the distances between inhabited centres were huge. And let's not forget, large armies are by and large walking. Now, in those circumstances, it's very easy to lose an army. And it's quite possible, as happened throughout military history, for armies to march past each other without being aware of that their enemies were over the next hill. And if you stand in the middle of a field, you can appreciate why this is so. So reconnaissance in the 17th century, and I would say even in the 20th century, was absolutely critical to an army. Without a good intelligence gathering operation, the army was blind. And in point of fact, in the Naseby campaign, we can see the consequences of this. Prior to the armies forming up ready for battle, Rupert sent his scoutmaster Roos out to look for the parliamentary army. Now Roos, in this case, as the information has come down to us, was somewhat lackadaisical in his duty. Essentially, he couldn't be bothered to pursue it properly. Went out for a ride, didn't find the parliamentarians, came back and said that they were nowhere to be seen. Rupert later rode out himself to see if he could find the parliamentarians, found them, at one point thought they were retreating, and meanwhile the parliamentarians were busily choosing the ground of their choice on which they were going to fight, and they found a very, very good defensive position from which to fight. Now, by contrast, the parliamentarians had very good intelligence, and they're well known for their intelligence gathering, their scouts going out. They knew where the Royalist army was, and they knew the movements of the Royalist army, and this gave them an inestimable advantage in the fight that was to come.
Estimates as to the actual strengths of the two armies vary. Fairfax's force is reasonably thought to have amounted to between 14,000 and 15,000 on the field that day. Estimates of the King's strength range from as low as 7,500 to as high as 12,000. The passing of time and the romanticising of King Charles's lost cause has led to the inadvertent exaggeration of the odds against him. As the legends have grown, so have the odds stacked against him. Some serious historians have placed the Royalist strength as low as 7,500, which would have placed the king at a near 2-to-1 disadvantage. At those odds there can be little doubt that even the ever-optimistic King Charles would have refused battle. The fact that Prince Rupert was against fighting that day is often cited as evidence for the lack of numbers on the Royalist side. However, in his memoirs, Lord Belaise, who fought at Naseby on the King's side, leaves us in no doubt. He recalls, "The army of Fairfax, as we conceive it, was about 15,000 men, while the King's army was not exceeding 12,000 horse and foot." Based on Belaise's account, a fair estimate of the Royalist strength would appear to be between 11,000 and 12,000 men, a significant but not insurmountable disadvantage. Whatever his actual strength, King Charles could certainly have used the support of Goring and his 2,000 cavalrymen, who had been sent into the west and who could not now reach him in time. Contemporary plans drawn by staff officers are often the only surviving visual references to the disposition of armies on Civil War battlefields. Fortunately, one such example survives on the subject of Naseby. It was drawn by Robert Streeter and was published with Joshua Spriggs' book Anglia Rediviva, first printed in 1647. From Streeter's work, we can clearly see that the armies were arranged in the traditional manner of the day, following the strict practice of warfare at the time.
In the 17th century, armies tended to be drawn up in a standardised pattern. There were technical differences. There was, for instance, the Swedish pattern and the Dutch pattern. But essentially, the way armies was drawn up was always roughly the same, and that is with the cavalry on the wings, that is on either side of the main body of the army, and the infantry in the centre. The artillery would then have been dispersed throughout the infantry regiments. And the regiments themselves were also laid out in a standard pattern, and that is with musketeers on the wings, that is on the outside, and a stand of pikemen in the centre. So essentially what you had was a kind of checkerboard pattern of both armies, and both armies would have been drawn up in that way at Naseby.
As Sprigg was Fairfax's chaplain, Streeter's map is naturally drawn from the parliamentarian position, that is, looking north from where the Roundheads were placed on Mill Hill towards the Royalist positions on Dust Hill. To the rear of the Roundhead army is the parliamentarian baggage train, which was to play a key role in the ensuing battle. Probably due to their superiority in numbers, the parliamentarian left wing was able to overlap the Royalist right wing unopposed. One important detail on that wing is the presence of a large body of dragoons under Colonel Oakey. They dismounted and lined the hedgerows which masked the right flank of the Royalist cavalry. These musket-armed horsemen were now in a position where they could pour forth a devastating fire into the ranks of the Royalist horse as they charged home across the front. The much-vaunted Royalist cavalry formed the bulk of the King's army. By this late stage of the war, as many as 2/3 of his force may have been horsemen. Prince Rupert commanded the right wing, and Langdale led the left. They were undoubtedly brave and courageous, as they had proved on many battlefields, but they were also highly undisciplined, as they had also proved before.
Rupert's failure to rally his cavalry after the attack on the parliamentary left wing is often cited as a reason why the Royalist army lost the Battle of Naseby, and in effect what they're saying is that it was Rupert's fault. Now, I think this is grossly unfair, to be perfectly honest. Rupert was doing what cavalrymen throughout history have done. There are more recent examples, for instance in the Peninsular War, the Battle of Waterloo and so on and so forth, where cavalry behaved in exactly that manner. Cavalry tried to break the cavalry opposite and then chase the stragglers from the field, and that is where most of the casualties occurred. The casualties didn't occur in the first clash, they occurred when the other side ran away. So in a sense Rupert was following cavalry tactics as he knew them, and also cavalry were often given the opportunity to plunder the baggage train precisely as Rupert intended. So to blame Rupert for the loss of the Battle of Naseby is unfair, given that he was behaving as cavalry behaves. What's more significant about Naseby is that Cromwell's cavalry didn't break through and then pursue the stragglers. Now there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that Cromwell's cavalry had more than enough men to be able to dispatch a couple of regiments to do the pursuit and the kill. But also Cromwell's cavalry was superbly trained. They could, for instance, gallop knee to knee, which was quite a remarkable feat if you think about it. They were also able to wheel at the gallop and maintain that contact knee to knee. So the significant thing about Naseby isn't that Rupert failed to rally, but that Cromwell was able to rally, and that's the thing that we should be paying attention to.
Facing Rupert and his cavalrymen, drawn up on the right flank of the Royalist army, were the parliamentarian troopers under Commissary General Henry Ireton. It was they who enjoyed the support of Oakey's dragoons. Over on the other flank, old Ironsides himself, Oliver Cromwell, led the parliamentarian right wing, against Sir Marmaduke Langdale and his northern horse. The cavalry forces could be said to be roughly equal in terms of ability. But as a result of Goring's absence, the Roundheads held the advantage in numbers. On Streeter's plan, we can clearly see how 3 ranks of Roundhead regiments are ranged against only 2 of Cavaliers. The same situation also prevailed in the infantry. The Royalist strength had dwindled to such an extent that a mere 4,500 Royalist infantry were expected to defeat some 7,000 parliamentarian foot. At about 10 o'clock on the morning of 14th of June, the Battle of Naseby commenced. Against all expectations, the battle began with a royalist success. On the right flank, Rupert's cavaliers clashed with Arten's Roundheads. After a fierce melee, Rupert's men sent them fleeing from the field. Unfortunately for the royalist cause, the prince could not stop his men from careering after them in hot-blooded pursuit. In the centre, the royalist foot, encouraged by the success of their horsemen, launched a ferocious attack on the parliamentarian foot, who also began to give way. At this point, the outnumbered royalist infantry desperately needed the extra support, which the victorious troopers of Prince Rupert's command could have given them, but it was not to be. As he had done at Edgehill, Rupert and his victorious cavalry had charged on after the victory, furiously pursuing the beaten enemy. In so doing, they charged right off the field and on to threaten the parliamentarian baggage train, which lay some 2 miles to the rear. As Rupert persisted with his unimportant efforts against the baggage train, things were going disastrously wrong back on the battlefield. In marked contrast to the events on the parliamentarian left, Cromwell on the right had succeeded in putting Langdale and his northern horse to flight. But Cromwell was a far more able commander than Prince Rupert. While some of his command pursued the fleeing cavaliers, the others turned inwards to attack the royalist foot, who were now being hard-pressed by the second line of parliamentarian regiments. It was now that the advantage of numbers really began to tell. Cromwell had the wisdom and the means to split his command. Langdale had no such luxury. As the royalist left veered towards disaster, over on the other flank, things were also beginning to go wrong. Here, Prince Rupert's continued absence allowed Colonel Oakey to saddle up his dragoons and charge across the empty space into the exposed flank of the royalist infantry regiments. Now threatened on 3 sides, it was only a matter of time before the royalist foot was annihilated. The hard-pressed royalists fought bravely, but courage alone was not enough in the face of such odds. Ultimately, they were swept away by the force of the combined assault on 3 sides. The royalist army was now in a full-scale rout. As his foot regiments fled from the field, King Charles made his famous decision to lead a last charge at the head of his own life guard. It was typical of Charles that he allowed himself to be dissuaded from doing so. The aged and hitherto insignificant Earl of Carnrath, with some choice Scots oaths, seized the king's bridle and turned his horse round and gave the order to march on the right. At his command, confusion or possibly panic seems to have spread through the ranks, and the king's life guard turned tail and fled the field. The battle was now totally lost. The king himself escaped the carnage of Naseby Field with a sizable body of cavalry and a much smaller body of foot. He was later joined by Prince Rupert with his cavaliers, who had escaped by a different route. The king sought to use these men as the core of a new army, but the writing was now on the wall. His cause was all but lost. There would never again be a royalist field army under the king's personal command. With an increasingly small band of followers, Charles travelled the country in the vain hope of raising more troops to his cause. He still hoped to join forces with Montrose, but in September came the crushing news that Montrose had been surprised and defeated at Philiphaugh, in the borders of Scotland. Charles was now the forlorn figure of legend, who by his own duplicity would make his way inexorably to the scaffold. Although defeated, he was king still, and after all, the parliamentarians had taken up arms not against his royal person, but those advisers around the king, who were now scattered or captured. Given the sad events of the next few years, Perhaps it might have been better had the unhappy monarch gone to a hero's death amidst the wreck of his last army.